In the deep wilderness stretching between modern-day Norway and Sweden lies a vast region known as Finnskogen, meaning the forest of the Finns. Today, it is a peaceful landscape of dense pine forests, mist-covered hills, and quiet lakes. But during the 17th century, this remote frontier became the setting for a brutal struggle where ordinary settlers found themselves trapped between rival kingdoms, roaming soldiers, and relentless violence. The story begins in the late 1500s and early 1600s, when waves of Finnish settlers migrated westward from the eastern forests of what is now Finland. At the time, Finland was part of the Swedish kingdom. These migrants, often called forest Finns, sought new opportunities in the vast wilderness along the Swedish-Norwegian border. The forest Finns were skilled pioneers. They practiced a method of agriculture known as slash-and-burn farming. Huge areas of forest were cut down and burned, creating fertile fields where rye could flourish. This technique allowed families to survive in regions where traditional farming was difficult. Life was never easy. Settlers built isolated cabins deep within the woods. Long winters, wild animals, and scarce resources tested their endurance. Yet they adapted, developing a unique culture that blended Finnish traditions with influences from both Sweden and Norway. At first, the border region seemed ideal. The forests were largely uninhabited, and authorities paid little attention to these distant settlements. But Europe was entering an age of constant warfare. The Swedish Empire was expanding aggressively. Under powerful rulers, such as Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden emerged as one of Northern Europe's dominant military powers. Meanwhile, neighboring kingdoms fought to protect their territories and influence. The borderlands suddenly became strategically important. Armies needed roads, supplies, and intelligence. Remote villages that once enjoyed isolation now found themselves caught between competing interests. For the forest Finns, loyalty became complicated. Some lived on the Swedish side, but traded with Norwegian communities. Others had relatives across the border. National identity mattered less than survival. As military tensions increased, governments demanded taxes, labor, and military service. Men who once spent their days hunting and farming were drawn into conflicts they barely understood. Rumors spread through the forests. Armed patrols appeared on remote trails. Smugglers moved secretly between settlements. Informants reported suspicious activities to military commanders. The dense wilderness offered perfect conditions for guerrilla warfare. Small groups could move unseen among the trees, strike suddenly, and disappear before regular troops could respond. What began as political rivalry between kingdoms would soon transform Finnskogen into a deadly battlefield. Villages would burn. Families would flee. Neighbors would turn against one another. The peaceful forest frontier was about to become a zone of fear and bloodshed. And for the people of Finnskogen, the coming decades would prove that even the most remote corners of Europe could not escape the violence of war. Long before gunfire echoed through the forests, the settlers of Finnskogen were building a remarkable society in one of Scandinavia's harshest environments. The forest Finns arrived carrying centuries of knowledge from eastern Finland. They knew how to survive where others saw only wilderness. Their expertise transformed vast stretches of forest into productive settlements. Unlike traditional Scandinavian farmers, forest Finns preferred isolation. Families often lived miles apart, connected only by narrow trails winding through endless woods. Their homes were sturdy log structures designed to withstand severe winters. At the center of many homes stood the famous Finnish smoke sauna. More than a place to bathe, it served as a social and spiritual center where births, healing rituals, and family gatherings occurred. The settlers spoke Finnish dialects, preserved ancient folklore, and practiced customs unfamiliar to their Scandinavian neighbors. Stories of forest spirits, mysterious creatures, and protective magic remained deeply rooted in daily life. These traditions sometimes created suspicion among local authorities. Church leaders worried about pagan influences. Government officials viewed the isolated communities as difficult to control. Yet the settlers continued expanding deeper into the wilderness. Their slash-and-burn agriculture proved incredibly effective. Entire hillsides were cleared and burned, enriching the soil with nutrients. Massive rye harvests followed, supporting growing populations. The success attracted attention. Landowners saw opportunity for profit. Tax collectors demanded revenue. Military leaders recognized the strategic value of people who knew every trail, stream, and hidden valley. The forest Finns possess another valuable skill, mobility. Accustomed to navigating dense forests, they could travel quickly across terrain that slowed conventional soldiers. They hunted expertly, tracked animals with precision, and survived in conditions that defeated outsiders. As tensions increased between Sweden and neighboring powers, military commanders began recruiting local guides and scouts from frontier communities. Some accepted willingly, others resisted. Many simply wanted to continue their lives in peace. But the borderlands offered little protection from political ambitions. Every new conflict brought additional demands. Taxes increased. Young men were conscripted. Supplies were requisitioned. Resentment grew throughout the frontier. The settlers understood that distant rulers viewed them as resources rather than people. Their forests provided timber. Their farms produced food. Their sons could become soldiers. Yet despite mounting pressures, Finnskogen remained relatively stable during the early decades of the 17th century. Families married, farms expanded, and communities prospered. Few could imagine how quickly everything would change. Beyond the forest, Europe was descending into chaos. Massive conflicts were reshaping entire nations. The Swedish Empire's military ambitions were growing larger every year. Soon, those ambitions would reach deep into Finnskogen, and when war finally arrived, the forest Finns would discover that their greatest strengths, knowledge of the wilderness, independence, and survival skills, could also make them dangerous participants in a brutal guerrilla conflict. By the 1630s, Northern Europe was engulfed in turmoil. The Swedish Empire had become one of the continent's most formidable military powers. Victories abroad brought prestige and territory, but they also demanded enormous resources. Every corner of the kingdom felt the strain. Finnskogen was no exception. Military recruiters traveled through frontier communities seeking able-bodied men. Taxes increased to support campaigns. Local authorities monitored border activity more closely than ever before. The forest settlers found themselves under growing pressure. Many families lost fathers, brothers, and sons to military service. Those who returned often carried physical and psychological scars from distant battlefields. At the same time, the border itself became increasingly unstable. Smugglers crossed secretly between Norway and Sweden. Escaped soldiers hid in remote settlements. Refugees fled violence elsewhere. The dense forest made enforcement nearly impossible. Government officials struggled to maintain control. Every path seemed to disappear into endless wilderness. Every hill concealed another valley. Every lake offered another route. The terrain favored those who knew it best. As a result, small armed groups began operating throughout the region. Some were deserters. Others were bandits. Some acted as unofficial agents, serving larger political interests. Distinguishing friend from enemy became difficult. Villagers often received conflicting demands from multiple sides. One day, Swedish soldiers might request food and shelter. The next day, another armed group could demand the same resources. Refusal carried serious consequences. Many communities learned to cooperate with whoever held power at the moment. This strategy ensured survival but created suspicion. Authorities accused settlers of aiding enemies. Neighbors questioned one another's loyalties. Trust gradually eroded. The forest became fertile ground for guerrilla warfare. Unlike conventional armies fighting on open battlefields, guerrilla fighters relied on surprise, speed, and intimate knowledge of local terrain. A handful of determined men could ambush larger forces, destroy supply lines, and vanish into the wilderness. Military commanders recognized both the threat and potential of such tactics. Some actively recruited local guides. Others feared frontier populations might become uncontrollable. In response, surveillance intensified. Informants were rewarded. Suspected collaborators were punished. Entire communities found themselves caught between military necessity and survival. The borderlands were changing. What had once been a distant agricultural frontier was becoming a militarized zone where suspicion ruled daily life. The people of Finnskogen stood at the edge of a dangerous transformation. The coming decades would witness raids, ambushes, revenge killings, and secret operations hidden beneath the shadows of towering pines. And the forest itself would become the ultimate weapon. As tensions escalated across the Scandinavian frontier, Finnskogen became more than just a borderland. It became a proving ground for a new and deadly way of fighting. The vast forests that had once protected settlers from the outside world now offered something else: the perfect battlefield for regular warfare. Traditional armies relied on open ground. Soldiers marched in formation, followed roads, and depended on supply lines. Their strength came from discipline, numbers, and organization. But Finnskogen was not a place where traditional military tactics worked well. The forest was dense and unforgiving. Narrow trails twisted through endless stands of pine and spruce. Marshes swallowed wagons. Hills and rocky terrain slowed movement. Visibility was often limited to just a few yards. For local settlers and woodsmen, however, these obstacles were advantages. The forest Finns had spent generations learning every feature of the landscape. They knew hidden paths that never appeared on military maps. They understood how to travel quietly through the woods, where to find food, and how to survive in conditions that challenged professional soldiers. As conflict spread to the borderlands, some of these skills began to take on military importance. Small groups of armed men started operating independently throughout the region. Some sought to defend their communities. Others were deserters avoiding military service. A few were bandits exploiting the chaos. Regardless of their motives, they shared a common approach. They avoided direct battles. Instead, they attacked unexpectedly. A patrol moving to the forest might suddenly come under musket fire from unseen attackers. A supply convoy could be ambushed at a narrow crossing. Messages carried between military outposts sometimes never reached their destination. The attackers rarely remained long enough to fight a prolonged engagement. They struck quickly and disappeared into the wilderness. To frighten soldiers, it often seemed as though the forest itself had turned against them. Military commanders struggled to adapt. They were trained to fight organized enemies, not invisible opponents who refused to stand and battle. Every expedition into the woods became a nerve-wracking experience. Men marched cautiously, constantly scanning the trees around them. The psychological impact was enormous. A single hidden marksman could delay an entire column. Rumors spread rapidly through military camps. Stories of sudden attacks and vanished patrols created an atmosphere of anxiety and distrust. Meanwhile, local communities found themselves caught in the middle. Guerrilla fighters needed food, information, and shelter. Soldiers demanded the same. Providing assistance to one side could provoke retaliation from the other. Many villagers tried to remain neutral, but neutrality became increasingly difficult. The conflict blurred the line between civilian and combatant. In many ways, Finnskogen witnessed the emergence of a form of warfare that would later appear throughout history. Small, mobile groups using local knowledge and surprise to challenge larger, better-equipped forces. The forest had become a weapon, and the brutal guerrilla wars of Finnskogen were only beginning. By the mid-17th century, the borderlands of Finnskogen had become a dangerous maze of loyalties, betrayals, and hidden warfare. Conventional armies struggled to control the region. The thick forest swallowed roads, obscured movements, and made large military operations nearly impossible. For guerrilla fighters, however, the wilderness was an ally. Small bands of armed men emerged throughout the border region. Some were local settlers defending their homes. Others were deserters, smugglers, or opportunists seeking profit in chaos. Regardless of their motives, they shared one advantage. They knew the forest better than any regular army. These fighters mastered hit-and-run tactics. They avoided direct confrontations, preferring ambushes along narrow trails and isolated roads. Supply wagons became prime targets. A handful of men hidden among the trees could strike suddenly, seize provisions, and disappear before soldiers could organize a response. Military commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Reports described attackers appearing like ghosts. Patrols vanished without warning. Scouts sent to track guerrilla bands often failed to return. The forest concealed everything. Fear spread among soldiers stationed in the region. Every snap branch sounded like an approaching enemy. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Nighttime proved especially terrifying. The darkness beneath the pines was nearly absolute. Guerrilla fighters used this to their advantage, moving silently through terrain that outsiders found impossible to navigate. Villagers often became unwilling participants in the conflict. Armed groups demanded food, shelter, and information. Refusal could result in violence. Cooperation, meanwhile, risked punishment from authorities. Families found themselves trapped in an impossible position. A farmer who provided bread to guerrillas might later be accused of treason. A villager who informed authorities could become a target for revenge. Trust collapsed throughout the frontier. Neighbor watched neighbor. Rumors spread rapidly. Communities fractured under the strain. The violence also affected trade. Merchants feared traveling through the forests. Essential goods became scarce. Economic hardship added another layer of suffering to daily life. Yet despite these challenges, many settlers continued to survive. They adapted as they always had. Generations of living in harsh wilderness had taught them resilience. But resilience came at a cost. Children grew up surrounded by stories of raids and killings. Entire communities learned to live with uncertainty. The line between civilian and combatant became increasingly blurred. The forest itself seemed transformed. What had once represented opportunity and freedom now concealed danger at every turn. As guerrilla warfare intensified, authorities realized stronger measures would be necessary. Military leaders prepared new campaigns aimed at restoring control over Finnskogen. What followed would bring even greater bloodshed. The struggle for the borderlands was far from over. The response from authorities was swift and ruthless. Unable to eliminate guerrilla fighters through conventional methods, military commanders adopted harsher tactics. Entire communities came under suspicion. Villages believed to support insurgents faced collective punishment. The logic was simple. If guerrillas depended on local populations for food, shelter, and information, then weakening those communities might weaken the resistance. In practice, the results were devastating. Soldiers conducted raids throughout the borderlands. Homes were searched. Livestock was confiscated. Food stores were seized. Suspected collaborators were arrested and interrogated. Many innocent people suffered. Families who had never participated in violence found themselves accused simply because they lived in the wrong place. Fear became a constant companion. The arrival of soldiers often caused panic. Children hid. Adults concealed valuables. Some fled into the wilderness rather than risk questioning. Guerrilla fighters responded with their own acts of retaliation. Informants became targets. Officials traveling through remote areas faced ambushes. Those suspected of cooperating with authorities sometimes disappeared without explanation. Violence fed more violence. Each attack justified another reprisal. Each reprisal inspired further resistance. The cycle seemed endless. The geography of Finnskogen amplified the conflict. Dense forests allowed fighters to evade capture, but they also isolated communities. News traveled slowly. Rumors filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Stories of atrocities spread rapidly. Some were true, others were exaggerated. All contributed to a growing atmosphere of terror. The psychological impact was profound. People no longer felt safe in places they had known their entire lives. The forest that once provided protection now concealed threats. Travel became risky. Trade declined further. Social bonds weakened. Church leaders attempted to restore stability. Priests urged reconciliation and obedience to lawful authority. Yet sermons often carried little weight compared to the realities people faced outside church walls. The conflict also revealed the limitations of state power. Despite military operations, authorities struggled to impose lasting control over such a vast wilderness. Guerrilla fighters continued adapting, changing tactics, and exploiting weaknesses. Many commanders privately admitted frustration. The forest seemed impossible to conquer. Every victory appeared temporary. Every captured fighter was replaced by another. As the years passed, the border war evolved into a grim contest of endurance. Neither side achieved decisive success. Instead, ordinary people paid the highest price. And the suffering was about to deepen as larger wars in Europe cast even darker shadows over the northern frontier. The violence in Finnskogen did not exist in isolation. Across Europe, the 17th century was an age of almost constant warfare. Major conflicts reshaped borders, economies, and societies. Powerful rulers competed for influence, drawing resources from even the most remote regions. The frontier communities felt every ripple. New taxes arrived. More men were conscripted. Additional supplies were demanded. For settlers already struggling under the burden of guerrilla warfare, these pressures proved overwhelming. Many households lost their strongest workers to military service. Fields went untended. Harvests suffered. Poverty increased. At the same time, returning veterans brought new experiences and skills. Some had fought in large-scale campaigns abroad. They understood military tactics, weapons, and logistics. A few applied that knowledge within the border conflict. Guerrilla groups became more organized. Ambushes grew more sophisticated. Communications improved. The frontier war evolved. Military authorities recognized the danger. They increased patrols and strengthened border defenses. Watch posts appeared in strategic locations. Roads were monitored more closely. Yet control remained elusive. The wilderness continued favoring those who understood it best. Winter added another dimension to the struggle. Heavy snow transformed the landscape. Frozen lakes became temporary highways. Skilled locals traveled efficiently using skis, while conventional troops often struggled. Some historians view these winter operations as early examples of northern irregular warfare. Small groups could cover astonishing distances under harsh conditions. They struck unexpectedly and vanished before reinforcements arrived. The environment itself became a weapon. Cold temperatures killed as effectively as combat. Exposure, starvation, and disease claimed lives on both sides. The hardships forged a reputation for toughness among the frontier population. Survival required extraordinary endurance. Yet even the strongest communities have limits. Years of insecurity took their toll. Families abandoned isolated farms. Settlements shrank. Economic growth stalled. What had once been a promising frontier increasingly resembled a region trapped by conflict. Still, people endured. They married, raised children, and rebuilt damaged homes. Life continued despite the violence. This persistence would become one of the defining characteristics of Finnskogen's history. But before peace could return, the borderlands would experience some of their darkest years. The struggle was reaching its most brutal phase. As the conflict dragged on, political loyalties became intertwined with personal grievances. Old disputes resurfaced. Land disagreements escalated. Family rivalries deepened. The chaos of war provided opportunities for revenge. In some cases, violence that appeared political was actually personal. A man might accuse a rival of aiding guerrillas. Authorities would investigate. Arrests followed. The accusation alone could ruin lives. Elsewhere, families targeted one another under the cover of broader conflict. The distinction between warfare and vendetta became increasingly difficult to recognize. These blood feuds added a new layer of instability. Communities fragmented. Trust vanished. People became cautious about what they said and whom they trusted. The consequences could be deadly. Stories circulated about midnight attacks, disappearances, and mysterious deaths deep within the forest. Some tales were undoubtedly embellished over time. Others were rooted in genuine events. The oral traditions of Finnskogen preserved memories of fear long after specific details faded. Legends emerged from the violence. People spoke of haunted paths, cursed clearings, and restless spirits wandering among the pines. Such stories reflected more than superstition. They revealed the psychological scars left by decades of conflict. The forest had witnessed immense suffering. For many residents, those memories became inseparable from the landscape itself. Meanwhile, authorities continued attempting to restore order. Punishments became harsher. Surveillance increased. Yet every new measure generated additional resentment. The cycle persisted. By now, entire generations had grown up knowing little else. Children born during the early stages of unrest reached adulthood in a world where violence seemed normal. This normalization of conflict worried both religious and political leaders. A society accustomed to bloodshed was difficult to govern. Efforts intensified to rebuild stability. Gradually, conditions began to change. Broader political developments reduced tensions along the frontier. Military priorities shifted elsewhere. The relentless pressure that had fueled guerrilla warfare started to ease. After decades of hardship, the possibility of peace finally appeared on the horizon. But peace would not erase the memories. The wounds of Finnskogen ran deep. Peace rarely arrives suddenly. In Finnskogen, it emerged gradually through exhaustion. After years of raids, reprisals, and uncertainty, many people simply wanted stability. Communities had lost too much. Farms lay abandoned. Families mourned loved ones. Economic opportunities had diminished. The appetite for endless conflict weakened. Authorities also recognized the limitations of military solutions. Suppressing unrest through force alone had failed repeatedly. New approaches emphasized administration, settlement, and integration. Roads improved. Communication expanded. Government presence became more consistent. These changes reduced the isolation that had contributed to instability. As transportation networks developed, frontier communities became more closely connected to broader society. Trade recovered slowly. Markets reopened. Economic activity increased. With greater prosperity came stronger incentives for peace. Former combatants returned to civilian life. Some resumed farming. Others entered trade or local administration. Not everyone adapted successfully, but many sought a fresh start. The cultural identity of the Forest Finns endured despite decades of turmoil. Their language, traditions, and agricultural practices continued shaping life in the region. At the same time, interaction with neighboring populations increased. A distinct borderland culture emerged, one influenced by Finnish, Swedish, and Norwegian traditions alike. The forests themselves remained central to daily life. They provided timber, game, and livelihoods. Yet they also carried memories. Older residents remembered the years when every trail might conceal danger. They shared stories with younger generations. Those stories became part of local history. Over time, some accounts evolved into legends. Historical events blended with folklore, facts mixed with memory. The result was a rich cultural heritage reflecting both suffering and resilience. Finnskogen survived. The communities that endured the guerrilla wars rebuilt their lives. Their survival stands as a testament to human adaptability under extreme circumstances. But the legacy of the conflict would extend far beyond the 17th century. The stories continue to echo through generations. And today, historians still uncover new details about this forgotten chapter of Northern European history. Today, Finnskogen appears peaceful. Visitors encounter quiet lakes, endless forests, and scattered settlements nestled among the trees. Few signs reveal the violence that once engulfed the region. Yet beneath the tranquility lies a remarkable history. The guerrilla wars of the 17th century demonstrate how ordinary people can become entangled in struggles beyond their control. Frontier settlers seeking opportunity found themselves caught between powerful states, military ambitions, and local rivalries. Their experiences reflect a broader truth about borderlands throughout history. Borders are rarely simple lines on maps. They are places where cultures meet, identities overlap, and conflicts often emerge. Finnskogen embodied all of these realities. The Forest Finns left an enduring mark on Scandinavia. Their agricultural innovations transformed wilderness into productive land. Their traditions enriched regional culture. Their resilience allowed communities to survive extraordinary hardships. The guerrilla fighters who moved through the forest represented another aspect of frontier life. Some were defenders, some were opportunists, some were victims of circumstances. Together, they shaped a conflict that blurred the boundaries between war and survival. Modern historians continue examining archival records, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence to better understand these events. New discoveries occasionally challenge old assumptions. The story remains complex. What is certain is that the people of Finnskogen endured decades of uncertainty, fear, and violence. Despite everything, they survived. Their descendants carried memories forward. Legends preserved fragments of truth. Historical records filled in other pieces. Together, these sources reveal a world where wilderness served as both refuge and battlefield. The forest protected communities while simultaneously concealing danger. They provided life and witnessed death. That dual nature defines much of Finnskogen's history. Today, when the wind moves through the towering pines and mist drifts across the lakes, it is easy to imagine a different era. An era of hidden trails, of armed riders disappearing into the woods, of settlers watching nervously from cabin windows, of a frontier stained by blood, yet strengthened by endurance. The brutal guerrilla wars may be centuries behind us, but their legacy remains woven into the landscape and memory of Finnskogen. And that is why the story of this forgotten border war continues to fascinate historians, descendants, and anyone drawn to the darker corners of the past. The forest remembers, and its stories are still waiting to be told. If you want more untold, dark, and forgotten chapters of history like this, don't forget to subscribe, and turn on the bell icon, because history doesn't end in textbooks. It hides in forests, ruins, and forgotten names waiting to be remembered. Subscribe to the Crit Story for more hidden truths from the past.